In 2004, a photo of a man with a deformed face went viral, attracting massive media attention. Documentary filmmaker Mark Lyda decided to visit the village of Odd, West Virginia, where he had heard many rumors about the origins of the photo. However, when Mark Lyda arrived, he could not have imagined that he was about to witness one of the strangest stories in American history. Welcoming him was an elderly man with a distorted face and twisted limbs. When asked something, he could only emit growls and incoherent sounds like an animal. This was a member of the Whitaker family. Not only him, but most other family members were also abnormal. It was not difficult to see why. Generations of inbreeding had turned this family into a cursed bloodline. The question arose, who was behind maintaining this lineage, and what secrets were still being hidden? Don't take your eyes off the screen, as the story of the Whitaker family will leave you in shock. Like and subscribe to join us in uncovering every chilling detail of this case. Since ancient times, humanity has understood that close blood relations bring nothing good. Children born from such relationships often suffer from birth defects, intellectual disabilities, and severe health issues. But what happens if a family practices this, not just for one generation, but for nearly a century? Odd, West Virginia, a small forgotten town nestled in the Appalachian Mountains. The locals follow an unspoken rule: do not go too close to the house in the woods. That house belongs to the Whitaker family, a lineage so feared that even the townspeople avoid mentioning them. No one knows their true origins. Civil records of the Whitaker family are nearly non-existent, as if they were never officially recognized in society. Some say they have lived isolated in these mountains since the early 1900s, practicing inbreeding for generations without interference. A former local mailman recalled, "I once delivered packages there. They didn't speak, just stared at me with eerie eyes, showing no reaction. Those people, they weren't normal." Additionally, reports suggested that since the 1930s, this family had maintained a tradition of intermarrying with close relatives. Initially, it seemed like just a habit of an isolated community. But over time, their descendants bore the horrific consequences of inbreeding. Developmental disorders, intellectual disabilities, some couldn't speak properly, while others struggled to walk, forced to crawl on all fours. These fragments were just part of the many rumors surrounding the Whitaker family. The people of Odd regarded them as a landmark of the town, but no one dared to approach. Even tourists were warned not to visit their home, not just because of the danger, but due to the hostility and rejection they showed toward outsiders. The Whitaker family might have remained a mystery forever, if not for one man brave enough to uncover the truth: Mark Lyda. A renowned documentary photographer, he had worked on numerous projects about society's forgotten people, those deemed strange, survivors of unimaginable tragedies. When the viral photo at the beginning of this video caught his attention, Mark became intrigued. Some called them a cursed bloodline, while others saw them as victims of extreme isolation. But no one dared to approach them. Mark Lyda knew this would be the story of a lifetime. In 2009, while working on his photo book Created Equal, Mark decided to seek out the Whitaker family. His book wasn't just a collection of images. It was a statement on how, regardless of background or circumstance, humanity shares common threads. But what Mark was about to witness was beyond anything he had anticipated. From the scarce information he gathered, Mark learned that the Whitakers were the clearest example of inbreeding in the United States. Not just one generation, but their entire lineage had practiced inbreeding for nearly a century. Equipped with a notebook, camera, and camcorder, Mark set out for Odd, West Virginia. At the time, the town had only 799 residents, and he assumed that with a few inquiries, he would quickly locate the Whitaker home. However, at the very first house he knocked on, Mark realized this would not be an easy task. A middle-aged man opened the door, staring at him with narrowed eyes, a shotgun in hand. "You'd better leave," he said coldly. Mark tried to explain his reason for visiting Odd, but the man simply shook his head. "I don't know anything, and I don't want to know. You're playing with fire, journalist." The door slammed shut in Mark's face. The townspeople of Odd did not want to talk about the Whitaker family. Everyone Mark approached either avoided his questions or said they don't want to be bothered. Lyda tried to explain that he wasn't a scammer or a sensationalist, but a documentary photographer wanting to capture the lives of those abandoned by society. However, the response he received was nothing but skeptical glares and outright hostility. The people of Odd were not naive. They had seen too many curious tourists, YouTubers, and outsiders looking to exploit the Whitakers for shock value, only to leave after taking a few pictures. And they would not allow anyone to harm the Whitaker family. Finally, after much effort and persuasion, Mark was given directions to the Whitaker family home. But as soon as he set foot there, he realized he was not prepared for what he was about to witness. The house before him looked like a scene from a horror movie. A dilapidated wooden shack, its roof half collapsed, the walls blackened with dirt and mold. There was no sign that this was a home where a normal family lived. The front yard resembled a garbage dump. Rusty old cars, broken furniture stacked in heaps, trash and filthy clothes scattered everywhere. The stench of rotting waste and wild animals filled Mark's nostrils. As he stood there, bewildered, the wooden door creaked open, and a figure emerged, bringing with it an eerie silence. The man standing before Mark looked unlike anyone he had ever seen. His face was grotesquely deformed, one eye nearly slipping out of its socket, his lips unable to close due to a malformed jawbone. His body was frail, his limbs distorted, but his hollow eyes carried an indescribable sorrow. At that moment, two more figures appeared. One was a woman with tangled, unkempt hair, walking with a limp, her frail arms bent unnaturally. The third, a much older man, crawled out of the house on all fours, moving like a beast. "This is insane. I've never seen anything like this," Mark gasped as he stepped further into the Whitaker property. The scene before him left him utterly disoriented. People with disfigured faces, vacant stares, moving in unnatural ways. Some walked upright, some hunched over, others crawled on all fours like animals. But the strangest part was how they reacted to Mark. As Mark approached, a middle-aged man suddenly widened his eyes and let out an involuntary scream. He turned and fled, but his oversized pants fell down, causing him to trip and crash into a pile of trash. The others began reacting as well. A woman, whom Mark later learned was named Betty, suddenly dropped to the ground, flailing her arms wildly, and started barking at him like a dog. Incoherent muttering, eerie shrieks echoed all around. One man burst into fits of laughter for no apparent reason, while another stood motionless, blinking rapidly as if struggling to comprehend what was happening. For the first time in his life, Mark felt a deep chill. Not from fear of danger, but from the unsettling realization that he was face to face with something beyond human comprehension. He realized that this was not an act, not a performance. This was how they lived, a direct result of a genetic defect perpetuated over generations. After the initial chaos, everything seemed to settle. Those who had reacted strongly before now observed Mark with curiosity. It was as if they recognized he was not a threat, yet they had no idea how to interact with him. Among them, only one seemed somewhat normal: Timmy. Mark soon learned that Timmy was the only one in the family who had graduated from high school. He could communicate, but his speech was slow, and he needed time to process before responding. Mark began a conversation with Timmy, hoping to learn more about the family. But when he asked about their history, Timmy simply shrugged and grinned sheepishly. He pointed at an old, faded photo on the wall and said, "That's Grandpa. Then Grandpa married Grandma. Then Dad married Mom. Then, I don't really know." This was exactly what Mark had suspected all along. Over multiple generations, the Whitaker family had intermarried and had children within their own bloodline. Meanwhile, Ray sat curled up in a corner, his hollow eyes staring blankly at Mark. Every time he tried to open his mouth, what came out were not words, but guttural growls and animalistic grunts. His facial muscles twitched as if struggling to form words, but failing completely. The other family members seemed to understand Ray perfectly. No one was surprised by his way of communicating. This was a primitive language system, something outsiders like Mark could never decipher. When Mark inquired about their health, no one had a clear answer. There were no medical records, no diagnoses, no one had ever been examined by a doctor. They did not believe in modern medicine, never took medication, and had no concept of healthcare. For generations, congenital diseases had appeared, but were never treated. Bone deformities, neurological disorders, speech impairments, all were accepted as a normal part of life. Mark flipped through old photos hanging on the wall. The black and white portraits had faded, but one thing stood out. All of them shared the same distorted features. Vacant eyes, high cheekbones, and an oddly asymmetrical mouth. Based on the information Mark gathered, the history of this family dated back to the 1930s, with twin brothers Henry and John as the originators of this tragic legacy. Their isolation from society led them to decide that they would only marry within the family, to preserve their wealth and lineage. Henry had 6 children, John had 9. As the next generation grew up, none left to marry outsiders. Henry's son married John's daughter. The cycle continued, unquestioned. By 1937, a new child was born every year. No one knew the exact number of children that resulted from this practice. In total, the first generation of intermarried relatives produced at least 15 offspring. Soon, serious health issues began to emerge. Some children were born with crippled legs, spinal deformities, and poor vision. Others had cognitive impairments and were unable to speak fluently. However, in more recent generations, some healthier children had started seeking partners outside the family. This was the first sign that the inbreeding cycle might be breaking. But was it enough to end a tragedy nearly a century in the making? The individuals Mark met in 2009 were descendants of the previous generations, children born from those who had introduced outside genes into the lineage. Some appeared more normal, could speak and think more clearly, but the genetic consequences had not completely disappeared. Mark took photos, recorded videos, and talked to them. In the images, the deformed faces, wild eyes, and lost expressions were still there, but somewhere deep within, there were faint glimmers of hope. After the encounter, Mark left, carrying with him footage and images that would leave the world in shock. Yet he could not shake off the haunting feeling about this family. 10 years later, 2020, Mark decided to return to Odd. This time, what he saw shocked him even more than the first time. The Whitaker family's home was now on the verge of collapse. The rotting walls, the roof riddled with holes, the yard, once merely dirty, had now turned into a damp swamp, filled with trash and mud. The family members Mark had met deteriorated. Their skin was more wrinkled, their bodies skeletal from malnutrition. Their clothes were so tattered and old that their original shape was barely recognizable. Freddie, one of the people Mark had previously spoken to, had died from a heart attack. There was no death certificate, no funeral. He was buried right there on their land, without a headstone, without anyone speaking of him again. When Mark returned to see Timmy, the only one who had once graduated from high school, he hoped to see signs of progress. But all he saw was despair, exhaustion, and resignation. Timmy was no longer the same as before. He had begun exhibiting animalistic behaviors, howling at strangers, and had lost the ability to communicate properly. Mark realized that if no outside help intervened, this family would not survive another generation. He decided to do something to save them. He began filming the most raw and unfiltered videos of their lives, uploading them to YouTube so the world could witness this horrifying reality. Years ago, when Mark first documented the Whitakers, the internet had not yet exploded, and people were skeptical of what they saw online. His footage had not been taken seriously, but in this digital era, things were different. The videos spread rapidly, shaking social media. People could not believe that in a developed country like the United States, a family could still be living in such horrific conditions. But Mark didn't just want to document their story, he wanted to take action. He launched a fundraising campaign to build a new house for the Whitaker family. Donations began coming in, but not as quickly as Mark had hoped. Many were shocked by the story, but only a few were truly willing to help. By 2022, Mark returned to Odd again. Though he had not raised enough to build a new home, he was determined to improve their lives as much as possible. The donations were enough to repair their roof, which had collapsed after a major storm. A new refrigerator was installed, allowing them to store food for more than just a day for the first time. Something that seemed so small, but to the Whitaker family, it was a monumental change. For the first time in years, they had real beds with springs instead of sleeping on moldy, flattened mattresses. But would these small changes be enough to save the Whitakers from their tragic fate? A stronger roof, a refrigerator, a more comfortable bed, but their bloodline remained the same. How much longer would this cycle continue? Would the next generation finally break free from this loop of inbreeding? Or would they remain trapped in the same cursed fate as the ones before them? There are still too many unanswered questions. Perhaps the truth will only be revealed when Mark returns for the next visit. But personally, I don't believe that intervention from the outside world can truly change something that has been ingrained in the subconscious of an entire bloodline. And that concludes this video. If you found this story fascinating, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share so we can continue bringing you more bizarre, emotional, and eye-opening stories.